Welcome to Game Plunge, a series all about the analysis and discussion of game design. In this episode we're going to talk about horror. More specifically, we're going to talk about Amnesia and how horror is implemented in the game. I still remember when Amnesia was just released, it quickly gained a lot of popularity among YouTubers simply because it was so scary. It was a game that was generally feared, and while many tried it out, I haven't heard of that many people actually finishing it. It made me wonder what Amnesia did to earn this infamous reputation. I have finished the game a few times to try and figure this out. This episode I will discuss my findings, and I'll try to give an answer to the question, what makes Amnesia such a scary game? To help us answer this question, it's helpful to gain some insight into what scary actually is. The way I see it, scary can be divided into a few categories. Now, I don't claim every scary moment in games will fall into these categories, but it does help to distinguish a few different types of scares in our analysis. The first category is probably the easiest way to scare your players, and I see a lot of simple amateur horror games focus on this type of horror. The jump scare. It's the jack-in-the-box of the horror genre. Something unexpectedly jumps out and makes you scared, but the fear instilled by a jump scare usually only lasts for a brief moment before you realize you're not really in danger. The second category of horror lingers with you much longer. It is the uncanny and unsettling type of horror. It's designed to unsettle you and make you feel uneasy. A particular type of unsettling is called the uncanny. Most of the time we can clearly distinguish between real and fake things, but somewhere on the scale between obviously fake and undoubtedly real, there is a deeply unsettling boundary. This graph roughly shows the human likeness of objects and their familiarity. At the far left we have simple objects which aren't human at all. Think of a house or an object that looks like it has a face. The further right we go, the more realistic things look. A bit more realistic, but still not uncanny, are the Muppets, for instance. They are animals with human traits, but they are still far enough away from reality to be seen as funny or cute. But when things get just a bit too realistic, we suddenly enter the uncanny valley. In this valley, things look almost real, but not quite. There is something off about them. It makes you feel uneasy just looking at it. Some examples are bad CGI or humanoid robots like this one. It doesn't look quite human, but it looks just a bit too realistic. This results in something that is really unsettling to look at, and it's an example of what, for me, resides in the uncanny valley. Anything more realistic than that looks realistic enough to not unsettle us anymore. But not only things in the uncanny valley will unsettle us. There are enough examples where horror movies or games unsettle the user without entering the uncanny valley. Showing gore, for example, is also a very popular way to unsettle your audience. The third category is intimidation. When a game poses you with a seemingly impossible challenge, it can be frightening. A good example of this is Dark Souls, where you're often required to fight enormous monsters even if you're dying or far away from a save point. The game scares you by making you feel weak and intimidating you with a large threat. While intimidation isn't always necessarily scary, it can certainly be used to scare the player. The next category is much more about the feeling of a threat than the actual threat itself. It's a situation where you can't see the monster, but you know it's lurking in the darkness somewhere. Occlusion is much more about what you don't show, so the users let their imaginations run wild. This can be pretty difficult to do since you don't want to bore your audience, but if you do it right, you can let the audience think something's going to scare them without actually scaring them. This makes sure the users are never truly at ease and are constantly on the edge of their seats. Finally, you can be scared by an overall sense of panic. Think of when a room slowly floods with water or when you're chased by a monster. You panic trying to quickly escape the danger. This is often made even scarier when the game forces you to calm down in a situation where you have no time to calm down. Now that we have a general idea of what can be scary, let's take a look at what Amnesia does with it. Right from the start, Amnesia lets you know it's going to be creepy. This overall eerie atmosphere is created, which is achieved by combining several things. First of all, Amnesia plays around with screen effects. The screen is blurry and distorted to make you feel uneasy. It disorients you and made me think of one of those fever dreams you get when you're sick. On top of that, there are all kinds of spooky things going on. Doors swinging open, lights suddenly turning off, hallucinations, that sort of thing. But probably the most important element of this eerie atmosphere is the music. Even when nothing is going on, the eerie atmosphere can be carried completely by the background music. The combination of ambient music and creepy sound effects set the tone perfectly for a horror game. Just walking around looking for things is still tense because of this music. If you're too scared to play the game and still want to try it out, simply muting the audio will make the experience much less frightening. But the audio does more than create an overall scary atmosphere. It also provides you with a lot of information. For instance, a specific sound plays to let you know when you completed a puzzle or when you found something important. It also tells you when you are in danger and when you are completely safe, because the audio changes when there is a monster chasing you. And even though you might not really notice it at first, the audio also conditions you to feel scared at the right times. Every time something scary happens, the audio plays a certain sound which usually warns you for something. But after a while, your sense of fear is linked to the sound that is played by the audio. The designers can use this to make you feel scared when they want you to feel scared, even when you can't see anything scary at all. But right from the start, Amnesia shows a different side of itself. Shortly after you're introduced to the scary nature of the game, you get to a room where you're pretty much stuck. Even though I played the game before, I didn't know where to go. I actually walked around aimlessly for quite a while before I found the hidden switch I was supposed to pull. Now this can simply be due to my own stupidity, but I still think it's a bit of a gamble to confuse the player this early on. While it introduces the concept of puzzles in the game, I can imagine this might put people off too early, which would be a shame since the puzzles later in the game are much more clever and fun to figure out. These puzzles are usually very similar to what point and click games use to challenge the player. It involves finding hidden objects or switches and figuring out what objects are used for what purpose. The dynamic of puzzles goes very well with the horror theme of the game for a few reasons. The first reason is pacing. We've talked about this before in the previous episode. If you missed the previous episode and you don't know what pacing is, just click here to get an explanation. As you know, pacing is very important to keep the players interested. But I think it's even more important for horror games, since the peaks of intensity are the main appeal of your game. This is why the puzzles are an important part of the game. They serve as a short break from the horror. You are forced to forget about the dangers lurking about, and need to think logically to progress. Having puzzles intertwined with the horror make the scary moments stand out much more, and you constantly switch from wanting to feel safe during scary moments to wanting to see some action during the puzzles. The second purpose of these puzzles is that they force you to look around, even when you're too scared to do so. You need to actively search rooms and dig through stuff even when you feel like you're being chased. You need to think in moments where you don't have time to think, and you're forced to explore even when it seems like a foolish thing to do. But not only puzzles force you to explore. Their mechanic of sanity is also a clever way to force the players into situations they don't want to be in. The way it works is that the longer you stay in the dark, the more your sanity is drained. The less sanity you have, the more difficult it is to play. Controls are delayed, it becomes a bit more difficult to see, and at times you can just fall down. The only way to keep your sanity up is by standing in the light. But in a game that is mostly dark, where do you find light? Well, there are two ways. You either fill up your lantern with oil, or you find tinder boxes to light torches and candles. But now you've got a problem, because even though standing in the light refills your sanity, you are now completely visible to the monsters. This creates an interesting balance between deciding to hide in the darkness but draining your sanity, or choosing to stand in the light and being completely exposed. Having to find enough fuel and tinder boxes means you're once again forced to look around, and it increases your chances of encountering something scary. Being forced into these scary situations is really frightening and thus can really immerse you into the game. These items are also a tool for the designers to use to guide the player towards the correct areas. Much like Super Mario, where coins help you keep track of your progress, finding tinderboxes and fuel cells tells you haven't explored this room yet. Another thing the designers can do is to place these items specifically to guide you towards an important item you need to progress. A lot of times when you're looking around in a room, the designers make you panic. They first make sure you're stuck in a room before spawning a monster near you. Like here, you're looking around for some items you can use when the door is suddenly getting knocked down. There is nowhere you can go and you have to hide to live. It is in these moments that I truly felt engaged in the game. I feel one of the great strengths of a horror game is how much it is able to draw you in with such moments. Amnesia is very good at creating panic. The weaker the player feels in relation to the monsters, the more scary those monsters will seem. To achieve this, Amnesia doesn't give the player any weapons at all. Your only way to survive is by running away. Sometimes you can't even easily avoid the monster, which makes it even more frightening. For example, in this part, you are forced to run past the monster to progress. You have nothing to defend yourself with. You're given just enough time to get away. The monster is fast enough to hit you a few times, but slow enough so you can outrun it. They do this a couple more times where you have no choice but to confront the monster and just run like hell. In this example, the panic is enhanced by forcing you to close doors and slow down while you're being chased. But Amnesia proves that just the feeling of being chased can cause panic. The mere suggestion that something can harm you can make it scary. You can see this in the infamous water part. This section was specifically designed around panic. The entire stage is flooded and there is something in the water. Even though you don't really know what it can do, just the fact that it's coming after you is enough to make you want to avoid it. You have to stand on crates to stay out of the water, but of course, some parts force you to leave your safe haven and quickly run through the water. The further you get in this part, the more panic is created and the longer it lasts. First, you just get short bursts of panic, where you skip from crate to crate, avoiding the monster. Then things get worse, where you're forced to slowly open a steel gate while having to distract the monsters. You're given just enough time to get through the gate and on top of one of the crates again. Finally, you just have to run without looking back. You have to go through a series of corridors to escape, and you're hurried to get away. You have to open doors and move things out of the way, all while you're being chased by something. Forcing the player to slow down while they're being chased is a sure way to intensify the tense, panicky feeling. As you can see, it doesn't even really matter what is chasing the player, as long as they can feel like something is constantly getting closer and closer. In the water part, this is done with the sounds of splashing. Later on, something similar is done with the darkness coming after the player. But the main horror in Amnesia is more about what you don't see. They use their monsters very sparingly, and every time you encounter them is an event on its own. But even though you rarely encounter the monsters, you constantly feel like they're there. It wasn't until my second playthrough that I noticed the monsters weren't in fact patrolling through the levels. Instead, they just spawn near the player at predetermined moments and then despawn afterwards. But it is done in such a way that you're never really sure when the threat is really gone. The monster usually just walks around a corner somewhere and you lose sight of it. I was actually able to catch it despawning to show you that this actually is how it works. Once again, the audio plays a big role here. You have been taught to listen to the audio to tell you whether you're really safe or not. But if the audio doesn't make it explicitly clear the threat is gone, the player remains tense because he doesn't know whether he's safe or not. Not showing the danger works wonders for the overall scary feeling of the game. It leaves room for the player's own imagination and you can let them feel scared of things that aren't even really there. The visuals of Amnesia were created to support this sort of imagination. The distorted screen and smoke make it so much easier to see things that aren't really there. It actually happened to me at one point. The audio was indicating danger, so I hid behind a few boxes to escape the monster. After waiting for a bit, I was wondering whether or not there really was something chasing me. I carefully stepped away from the boxes and looked around a corner to see if there was a creature coming towards me. And there I could swear I could see something walking towards me. But when I looked at the footage later, it appeared nothing was really there. It was all in my head. The thing I recognized as a monster was nothing more than a silhouette I recognized in the mist in the darkness. I think this moment shows the strength of Occlusion and why you should show your monsters sparingly to keep the gameplay tense. But it isn't easy to do this correctly. There is a fine line between showing the monster too much and making the moments without the monster less tense, and showing the monster too little, making the game boring. Amnesia handles this problem by making sure the player never feels quite at ease. This is where the unsettling parts of Amnesia come in. The designers regularly unsettled the player by using gore. They made the monsters look like a body that was stitched together. It's unsettling to look at because of this disfigured look. It fits within the plot of the game about human experimentation and torture. The very idea of human experimentation is unsettling, and not only the monsters but the environment as well tell you a lot about the horrible things that happened within the castle. You frequently come across piles of blood, cut off limbs and dead bodies. These are some simple but effective ways to keep the player feeling uneasy. Later in the game, you're also shown some torture devices. While it's interesting to learn about, at the same time it is horrifying to think that these objects were actually used to torture humans. To unsettle you even more, you're given some extra information with audio and text to truly make sure you understand how horrible these tools were. But gore isn't the only way to make players feel uneasy. The level design also plays a big role in making you feel uneasy. Just look at the levels in Amnesia. The vast majority of it consists of narrow corridors and rooms with low ceilings. These cramped spaces make you feel vulnerable because there isn't really anywhere to go, and if you encounter an enemy, it's difficult to escape and you feel locked in, claustrophobic even. But the exact opposite works as well. Horror games with large open areas make use of the fact that humans are instinctively unsettled by vast open areas. Did you ever notice that public benches are usually placed in such a way that we have as much overview as possible? Usually there's a wall behind them or a tree, because we don't like the idea of being exposed. The idea of having a large open area behind us is unsettling because it makes us vulnerable to attacks. This can also be used, or rather abused, in horror games. A good example of this is Slender, with the large open areas, the trees and darkness. The Slender Man could be hiding anywhere and you're completely exposed at all times. You need to keep frantically looking behind you to make sure you're safe. The openness of the world is unsettling and plays an important role in making the player feel scared. We've looked at how mechanics, environment and level design all work together to make Amnesia the scary game it is. As we've seen, Amnesia uses mostly panic, occlusion and unsettling to scare the player. Keep in mind that simply scaring someone is pretty easy. Just jump someone when they don't expect it. But really unsettling the player and making an overall scary horror game is much more difficult. It requires a combination of many different disciplines and careful consideration for what you do and don't show. On top of that, the game has to be interesting enough to keep you playing. Amnesia managed to frighten a lot of us while still being an interesting game to play. If you're interested in horror games, Amnesia can teach you a lot about what it takes to make a horror game truly scary.